Hello, my name is Jester, and I am going to be speaking to you today about ClinicalTrials.gov and what you need to know. I am with UAB, and although I am focused on providing services to UAB for ClinicalTrials.gov reporting and registration, what I will be telling you is applicable to any site and any investigator who's doing a study that may be required to be registered and or have results reported on ClinicalTrials.gov. So let's go back to even why ClinicalTrials.gov is in place. The whole thing about registering online with protocols began in about 2000 when ClinicalTrials.gov began. It wasn't until 2007 when it was required that if you had a protocol that meets certain parameters, that it needed to have results reported, and they built a whole system whereby certain protocols could have results reported on the ClinicalTrials.gov website. When the website was first built, it was built for the purposes of just registering all protocols and having a central location nationally where we could find especially industry studies that were that were being conducted across the country. The purpose and the rationale, the initial rationale behind building ClinicalTrials.gov was to know what was going on and to make sure that there was full disclosure about studies that were being implemented nationally. Why would we want to do that? For really the purposes of disclosing to our public the studies that they're on, the studies they might be on, and ways of, again, providing them with the results of those studies. And I'll get to that in a minute when it comes to the change in the law that took place in 2007. So this is simply a quote from from the European Union, because this is clearly an international issue. It can be considered that the data belong to participants and by extension to the wider society. It can't be owned by commercial entities or academics. Clearly, the whole point, again, is disclosure and transparency in what we do related to research. So the objectives during this 15 to 20-minute presentation will be to define the purpose of ClinicalTrials.gov, define what the FDAAA law is, review recent events related to clinical trial disclosure and patient-level data sharing, operationalize operational challenges on registering protocols and reporting results on ClinicalTrials.gov, and some practical advice and tips on how to make the registration and results reporting process go more smoothly. So what is the law? As I described earlier, ClinicalTrials.gov website was built in about 2000. At that time, protocols were supposed to be posted or registered, another way of describing posting them. The scope in 2007 was to say, okay, now we need to make sure that we report the results. If you do a study and it doesn't prove anything, if an investigator does a study and the results are bad, a lot of times preparing a manuscript is difficult for them to do because a journal might not want to publish it. They'll say, that was not a very important study, we're not going to publish it. So it gets published in a very no-name journal that nobody reads, even though a bad study can be very informative to someone who's preparing a subsequent study, maybe of the same topic, with the same drug, with the same population. And if they don't know that a study did take place that had negative results, they're going to repeat the same issue. Hence, the purpose of having the data reported publicly. It also was determined that if it's reported publicly, the population, the people who participate in the studies, the people for whom the NIH is supposedly doing studies, trying to improve the public health, doctors around the country, the population, people who are participating in studies, people who care about their health care, they're not going to go out and buy journals to try and understand about the parameters of a new drug, to understand studies that have been done. If they want to, they'd have to spend a lot of money buying journals. Hence, the advantage of having a site on the web whereby data can constantly would constantly be available for free on the results of a study. Again, we'll talk about what that means. The studies that are required to have results reported are called applicable clinical trials, ACTs. ACTs, and this again began in the law that was generated, the FDAAA law, Food and Drug Administration Amendment Act. There are two main categories within the FDAAA law. One is registration, which must take place within no later than 21 days after the first subject is enrolled, and results must be reported within 12 months after the last subject has met his or her primary endpoint, and there are some exceptions to that. The results reporting not only includes the outcome measures that are gathered for the protocol, the results, and again, the summary results for those outcome measures, and by extension, but also by adverse event reporting, any adverse events that have been reported. There are permitted to be extensions of the timeline. We had a study whereby there was a primary endpoint at 6 months. Secondary endpoints were not met for 2 years. And it was a blinded study, randomized, controlled, blinded study. Had we not requested a delay in reporting the results, we would have been unblinding the study prior to the secondary outcome measures being gathered. So it would have been problematic and would have affected the integrity of the study. You will notice the asterisk and the statement at the bottom. Although ClinicalTrials.gov registration is to be done no later than 21 days after enrollment of the first subject, per ICMJE, registration before the first enrolled subject is required. Well, so what is an applicable clinical trial? It's an intervention study, drug, biologic device. It can also be considered in any study that's required FDA-approved drug, biologic, and/or device, and/or an IND/IDE study. All of those would be applicable clinical trials. Now, I will probably mention this later, but this requirement is somewhat changing, and there is a great movement nationally and by Congress to not only include these trials that are defined here that would be under the purview, essentially, of the FDA, but also clinical trials that are behaviorally related. And based on the rationale for the website, it would make sense to post those results also. And again, keep in mind, this is ACTs are protocols that must have the results reported. A lot of times, journals will ask that protocols be registered, even if they don't meet this definition. And when you register, you get what's called an NCT number, a National Clinical Trial number. It's 9 digits, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. But so you may certainly register anything outside of the applicable clinical trial definition, but only by law are the results required to be reported. So what is not an ACT? Again, it's not conducted or manufactured within the U.S. under the U.S. FDA jurisdiction. So if you have a drug that's manufactured overseas and the study is conducted in India, and even if the PI is in this country, at this time it is not required that the results be reported on ClinicalTrials.gov. Right now, phase 1 and pilot are not required. However, the key point here is only if there are no efficacy endpoints. A lot of times we do phase 1 studies that have efficacy endpoints. Hence, those protocols must have results reported. You know, I think when the law was written, they looked at the phase 1 as the true definition of first time in subjects, healthy subjects. We're just trying, we're not really looking for efficacy. That is sort of the standard definition of phase 1. Clearly, if you're doing a cancer study, clearly many studies are defined as phase 1s, but do not, but do have efficacy endpoints. Observational studies to date are not required, though again, as I say, that may change. Behavioral registries, again, not required. We have conducted a number of studies with the NIH, and at least for a period of time, they were requiring that every one of their protocols be registered on ClinicalTrials.gov, even the natural history. Your sponsor, whoever your funding agency is, your institution may define what needs to be registered differently. But again, the law only really addresses what is required for results reporting. So clearly, as I've said, we may have 300 protocols registered on ClinicalTrials.gov at our institution. That's registered, but we may only have about 100 that have results reporting. And keep in mind, if you work with a pharmaceutical company, they will do the registering and results reporting. But if it's investigator initiated, and if it's usually NIH funded or foundation funded, the PI at your institution may be required to do the registration and results. Are there, again, exceptions to the FDAAA? Again, if the study is, if not, just to reiterate, is not an applicable clinical trial, both, again, are registration and results reporting are based on the PI's preference, industry's request, NIH request, and a journal's requirement. We have actually had investigators come back to us. They conducted the study, they've analyzed the results, they have even submitted their manuscript to a journal, and the journal won't publish until the PI obtains an NCT number. So we just go in and we, again, assist them in registering. Either we assist them or they do it on their own. They register their protocol and obtain an NCT number, and that's all there is. They don't report results, but they get the NCT number for the journal. Once it's registered and approved, the clinical trials states the record will not be removed. You probably can get it removed if you need to, but once what it is, you do your registration, and then once it gets published publicly, then it cannot be removed, is what that means. So there's the key requirements. Responsible party, that's generally the principal investigator, or it could be the IND IDE holder. It might be, again, it could be industry, could be the holder of the RP, the responsible party, cooperative group, consortium, or other. At our institution, the responsible party tends to be the PI. It can also be the institution. As the sponsor, we can also assist the investigator in being the responsible party. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there are two components to ClinicalTrials.gov. There's registration and results reporting. Registration, obtain access, complete registration. So let me step back. So when you go to register, you do need to make sure you have access. You can go to your what's called the Protocol Registration System Administrator, PRS Administrator. Every institution has one, and they are the person at your institution who will give you access to register and or results report. Registration itself must be completed by the PI. It might require updating. Again, you may get questions once you've registered, submitted the registration, and then you just tweak it to address the questions. The one thing about the FDAAA system, they have a very rigorous QA process. So they will help make sure that when you enter data, when you enter your registration, that you don't have conflicting information. We all make errors. We all make mistakes. So it's nice to have someone look back at your work and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. You said here you were enrolling 20 subjects, and here you said you were enrolling 14. Again, it's a really good system, and you can always go back in and fix. With registration, you are to go in every 6 months and update. Sometimes it's simply a matter of changing the date you looked at it. There is a registration required update field, and when you go into the system, you simply update that to the current month and the current year, and that tells the system, yep, I looked at it this month, and there's nothing more we need to do, nothing has changed. Generally, little changes from the time you initially register until you go to report your results. The only time something might change within the registration is if you have a new amendment, or if you add a site, if you're a multi-center study, if you're conducting a multi-center study. So these are basically the key data elements for protocol registration. It's quite a lot, but the system is very, very user-friendly. You will find it quite easy to use. It gives you definitions for each of the fields, and it also provides you with guidance on how to complete fields, and if you enter something incorrectly in a field, like if you put the year as 2020, it will tell you you made a mistake. So it's a very, again, it's been well programmed and well designed. There are some of these fields are not required. I mean, like, for example, DSMB, you can answer yes or no. There may not be a DSMB for your study. The one thing that I would point out that we have found to be very helpful is how you address brief title. Keep in mind the ClinicalTrials.gov website is set up for one purpose, was set up to help anybody find, if they have a disease, to go to ClinicalTrials.gov and find out if there is a research study that's being conducted on the disease of their interest, maybe close to where they live. So what you can do is, what a person can do when you're filling this out, let's say you have a study for diabetes, or maybe juvenile diabetes. What I would do, even though the official title may be really convoluted, phase 1, phase 2, study of X drug in juvenile diabetics. Again, that would be your official title. If you modified your brief title, which there are no parameters on what that brief title can be, it's up to you. If you defined it, if you change the title to say juvenile diabetes, use of X drug, or testing of X drug. Again, what we're looking at is a way that when someone goes in to do a search, you know how searches are, they come up alphabetically, or they come up with the most important name first, the one you're looking for. So if you change the title to where the public will be able to find your study more easily, it may benefit you. And again, that's on the kind of the search side of ClinicalTrials.gov. But again, brief title, it can be whatever you want. I think the reason we have in red here the primary completion date and study completion date are just to remind you that the important aspects of those are, primary completion date is the date the last subject meets his or her primary endpoint. And that's what starts the clock ticking for when you're going to have to report your results. Study completion date is when the whole study is over, when the last subject has made his or her visit, whether it's primary endpoint or not. The other item on here that I have not highlighted is outcome measures. And when you go to register your protocol, and particularly if you are going to be reporting results, make sure your outcome measures are measurable, such as number of subjects who achieve blood glucose of 100, or whatever you decide it to be. Again, very measurable. It'll make it easier reporting your results. If you write it in a very vague way, and I had one investigator who tried to write an outcome measure that was about 8 lines long. It was very lengthy, and it was never going to work. If you don't write it in a measurable way, ClinicalTrials.gov will come back and question you and ask you to fix it. So just as a heads up. When you complete your registration, you will notice some important things. There'll be a warning, which means that you can't go further. You cannot do anything. You're not going to be able to lock this form. You'll never get it'll never be able to be registered if you see a red warning. You will see some other warnings that say note, and it's like, well, and what ClinicalTrials.gov is saying here is, well, what you just wrote didn't make sense to us, but okay. So they won't, the note in blue, that won't stop you. Also on the system off to the left, there's a section edit. You click on that, and then you can make any changes you need. Common errors in registering, spelling. Again, when you're describing your intervention, be sure to describe dose, frequency, and route of administration, if it's applicable, or how the device is going to be used, or what the intervention is. That doesn't quite make sense, does it? What the intervention actually is. The outcome has to be, the title, as I mentioned, has to be, they'll come back and question you if it's not measurable. There's a time frame for the outcome. It has to be baseline to month 6. You can't just say month 6. There's a time frame, baseline to month 6. Again, keep that in mind, something that will be clear. Outcome measure description, make sure it's clear. This is where we have a hard time. The one thing I haven't mentioned is when you're filling out ClinicalTrials.gov, what this system was built to do, again, as I said earlier, was to be readable, accessible to the public, and even to doctors who may not be really into research and may not have a lot of, may not understand the language that we as researchers use. So when you write anything in ClinicalTrials.gov, always have a mindset that this is going to be read by the public. It's not going to be read by your colleagues sitting at the next desk. It's not going to be read, it's not being written for the purpose of helping them understand the study. It's being written to help the public understand the study. It is really hard to take it down to, let's say, we think about our IRBs to like 6th grade level. That's nearly impossible. But keep in mind that when you do the results reporting, the more descriptive statistics you use, the simpler the language, the better, again, it will be received. If it's too complex, ClinicalTrials.gov, they'll come back with queries and say, can you explain this better? Can you simplify it? So go in, and when you write it, keep it try to keep it readable. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you will go in there's a record verification date that you would need to update every 6 months, just to simply say, I reviewed it and it's fine. When you do update a record and or report results, it always has to be approved and released by either the responsible party or the PRS administrator, depending on what your institution, how they want to manage that. Again, every 6 months I would review the whole record. But generally, if you know nothing's changed in the protocol, you know there's nothing going to be changed on your registration. Common mistakes, again, studies are not registered. This is the more general, more global issues. We have found sometimes the studies don't even get registered. So trying to get the word out to investigators as to what they need to be doing and how they need to be addressing the registration. Incorrect responsible party. Sometimes records are not approved or released. So if you are a coordinator or an office administrator, and you can go in, you usually can get access to go in and update the record. You cannot approve it. It needs to be approved by the responsible party, and or, as I said earlier, if your institution agrees to it, the PRS. When we report results, we always want the PI to approve that because that's critical. With results reporting, as long as the PI says it's good, we have allowed the PRS to go in and approve and release the record. And once you do that, then it goes out to the public. So you think about this. You do your registration first. It gets released. Every 6 months you look at it, and it has to be approved and released yet again so that it can be updated. So it will be clear on ClinicalTrials.gov that you're doing your every 6 month update. Another problem that often happens is CT.gov QA comments are not addressed. When you go into the system, if there's been a QA of the protocol by ClinicalTrials.gov, they may have questions. And the questions will keep you from actually releasing the protocol to be posted on ClinicalTrials.gov. Results reporting. Most important thing, start early. Start when you're writing the protocol. Make sure your outcome measures are right. I cannot explain what a big difference that will make when it comes to results reporting. I also would encourage you that only the primary and secondary endpoints need to have their results reported. If you have tertiary, if you have exploratory, those are not required by law to be reported. Do not be surprised if you submit your results and it goes through the QA process and it comes back to you. I have one investigator, we have been working, it comes back to you with questions. I have one investigator, we've been working for several years to make sure that they have appropriately and that they have answered all of their questions and queries from CT.gov appropriately. Critical to remember, these results are being posted publicly. So as I said earlier, keep them simple, keep them clear, make sure they're consistent with the manuscript. It is true that people take what's posted on ClinicalTrials.gov and compare it to the journal that has also been published for the same study. You do not want to have discrepant data on either. You want them to be concise. Only report the required analysis. You do not need to report anything outside of the outcome measures, the primary and secondary. You can, but I would not waste my time. I would not spend my time doing that. I know you all have more things to do than making work for yourselves. As I said earlier, confirm internal consistency. Make sure you use the correct units. It is not an analysis. This is just results reporting. You can report some analyses, like the p-value there are more steps to go through to report all of that, and you will need a statistician to help you most likely with that component. Again, remember, these results are going to be read by the general public, and again, complicated study analysis, be sure you have your statistician involved. You can request an extension. I mentioned to you the issue of the secondary endpoint that took place like 18 months after the primary endpoint. You can request an extension, but I would do it cautiously because in case you're ever questioned about why you asked for an extension. I had one investigator who requested an extension of like 6 years simply because he had not had a chance to look at the data. That is something you don't want to put in writing, and you don't want to let the NIH or the FDA it's just not good practice to delay that sort of results reporting. Here are the key elements for results reporting. I'm not going to read through these, but they will be on your slides and in your handouts. Again, it's really, maybe the most cumbersome part of results reporting after the primary and secondary outcomes are it could be the adverse events and the serious adverse event reporting. This can be tedious and can take up a lot of time because for SAEs, they want everyone listed. For AEs, it's a lot more of summary data. Again, there are the two adverse event tables. The critical thing to remember when it comes to your adverse events, so they want every SAE reported, and with your adverse events alone, you can actually determine if you're only going to report those that occur at a greater than 5% frequency or 1% frequency. You get to determine the scope of the threshold you will be using. Here are some of the most common errors when entering data. The summary data, not raw data, should be uploaded. Again, there is a movement out there to where there's a consideration in Congress that the results will need to be, the actual raw data will need to be uploaded. We're not there yet, and we're going to hope we don't get to that point. But just know that you need to keep your ears open to see if things change. Again, adhering to the reporting time points. Again, it's real important. There is a fine if you do not report your results within 1 year after the last subject has met his or her primary endpoint. To date, those fines have not been implemented, but they're quite significant. So as long as the government doesn't need the money, then we'll be fine. But should they be implemented, you don't want to be caught on the end of having to pay a significant fine because of delayed results reporting. Narrative analysis is not accepted. It's got to be the results, not the raw data, the summary of the results. Poorly written endpoints are quite a problem. Again, try and focus on that early when you're setting up your registration. Often it's found that the data might not be consistent. As I mentioned earlier, you may say in one place that you enrolled 30 subjects and in another place you say you enrolled 15. Again, we all make those mistakes, but you'll find it, and if you don't, the QA system will find it for you. Delegating entry to non-research personnel can be quite a challenge. It can be done, but this has brought up issues of understanding the data and the results that require significant work. Again, no one managing it. Sometimes ClinicalTrials.gov falls into a black hole. Failure to approve and release. That is, again, once you've completed it, it's got to be approved and released. Lack of attention to the QA comments, even with data entry. Here are some additional comments of the common errors, misspelled words. Spell out all your acronyms, must be consistent with the manuscript, as we said earlier, clearly written measures, identify at your institution who can provide guidance, who can provide education, and who can help assure you're compliant with your institution expectations. You can use calendar reminders, create tools to remind you to keep up with the registration, and then when the results are due, make sure you know and keep that at the forefront of your daily activities. If any of you are using a clinical trials management system, this can also be advantageous in keeping up with ClinicalTrials.gov. The CTM tool may have fields that mirror your CT.gov registration. Again, making sure your endpoints are clearly written. Be aware when you're collecting data that what the reporting format will be and what the requirements are of ClinicalTrials.gov. And again, just as a reiterate, know your endpoints. Here are some references that you may be of help to you. Please feel free to contact me at UAB if that would be of help. And please contact me if you have any questions. I would be glad to help you or refer you to someone who might be able to help you. Thank you all.